The crisis that haunts the German national team for years is certainly its deepest, but not the first one. In the late 1990s, the downturn has been perhaps even more surprising. A few years after the famous quote of Franz Beckenbauer, who in his farewell press conference as a head coach in July 1990 was confidently predicting that now, with the fresh World Cup title in the pocket and the upcoming reunification of the country, Germany will be in the ascendancy of the international football for decades. The Bundesteam suddenly encountered the deficit of high-quality players. The proverbial Bosman case, which resulted the effective abolishment of any limits for foreigners on the pitch, did hurt Bundesliga most of all. Whilst in Italy, Spain and England the amount of footballers from abroad increased even steeper, the potential damage has been alleviated by their high quality. Meanwhile, in the Bundesliga, the vast majority of clubs back at that era couldn't afford to buy expensive players, given the pathological desire to avoid debts and a relatively low level of revenues from TV contracts and sponsors. Having said that, the heat of the battle in the relegation zone, where every tiny mistake proved to be extremely costly and in which virtually every club, barring Bayern, could have been embroiled, forced managers to bet on experienced and therefore reliable players, even if their skills were heavily limited. As a result, the mid and bottom table clubs weren't inclined to invest money and efforts in the development of young lads, opting to acquire mediocre foreigners from Poland, Croatia, Bulgaria, Serbia and Africa instead, just because they were significantly cheaper than the German players of such caliber. At the same time, the major Bundesliga clubs, Bayern, Borussia Dortmund and Bayer, continued to stably field 7, 8 or even 9 native players, but it was almost impossible for the young Germans to make their way there, bearing in mind the depth and standard of excellence that big teams had. Always little by little led to the genuine catastrophe. While the number of minutes that the footballers of domestic origin played in the elite echelon decreased basically by half within 3 seasons, from 1996 to 1999. The talented players stopped to appear at all. Just Mikhail Ballack has been able to reach a star status, but even he went to glory in a rather leisurely pace. At the not exactly tender age of 23, he was a solid footballer and only within the next couple of years elevated himself to the level of top performer. As a consequence, both Berti Vogts and Erich Ribbeck, who managed the Germany national team in the late 1990s, were mainly focused on squeezing the last ounces of energy from the famous veterans. Almost all of them, the likes of Lothar Matthäus, Thomas Hässler, Stefan Reuter, Andreas Möller and Jürgen Kohler, albeit the last trio quit international football long before finishing career, hung up their boots in the very late 30s. Naturally, this tactic was doomed to failure, and if the loss to Croatia in the World Cup 1998 quarter-final shell-shocked many people, the ignominious exits from Euro in 2000 and 2004 after the group stage were taken almost for granted. The second place at the World Cup in 2002 stood out from the general tone indeed, but if we recall the circumstances under which this result was obtained, even that tournament will fit into the overall picture quite well. In South Korea and Japan, Germany avoided facing marquee name opponents until the ultimate match, courtesy to the extremely lucky draw and strange nature of competition, while the play of the team could be characterized as ascetic and banal tactically. In terms of personnel, that squad was hardly stronger than the one that performed prior to it and after at the Euro. Only Oliver Kahn and Ballack were world-class footballers in that particular moment. As for Miroslav Klose, he reached his peak significantly later. The true stature of the team and its potential, perhaps, has been brought to the fore in everyday practice. When initial euphoria after the arrival of charismatic Rudi Völler was left behind, and wins over Spain in a friendly match and against England in the World Cup qualifying contest in 2000 become a part of history, it suddenly appeared that it's pretty hard to compete with the best without a huge emotional boost. Since that point, Völler and co lost incredible 8 games in a row against top national sides, including friendlies, and this plausibly reflects the skills of the Germany side. The following upturn of the German national team is inextricably linked with the reform, which put an extra emphasis on thorough preparation of young players. This is partly true. In the late 2000s, Bundesliga started to produce more talents, which at least allowed to abandon the dubious and in a way even vicious practice of assimilating those footballers who were born outside the country and initially had very little to do with it, like Gerald Asamoah and Paulo Rink. But also true is the fact that in terms of playing resources, Germany, even in those successful years, didn't return to the level of the early and mid-1990s, when the amount of high-quality footballers was measured in dozens and not in units. For illustration purposes, let's compare the World Cup 1990 and 2014 winning squads. How many players from the latter could and should enter the starting lineup of the first one? Arguably, only Manuel Neuer and Philipp Lahm. As good as Klose and Thomas Müller were, not many will swap them for Völler and Jürgen Klinsmann. The same goes to Mesut Özil from one side and Hessler and Pierre Littbarski from the other one. As for Bastian Schweinsteiger or Toni Kroos, there are even fewer people who prefer them to the prime Lothar Matthäus. Obviously, the times are different, with teams separated by almost a quarter of a century. They used different tactical formations. Beckenbauer in 1990 deployed a 3-5-2 alignment with a sweeper, and Joachim Löw in 2014 mainly opted for a 4-5-1 scheme. The rules also palpably changed during those years, but the stature of the players lends itself to a comparison, and the general thought is that even in 2014, being at the undeniable peak, Germany didn't possess fabulous amount of talent. The fact is that while the prime reason of the German dominance and unique, enviable stability in the international football throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and the most part of the 1990s was quantity of high-profile players in the decade of prosperity. Let's call so the period encompasses 2006 and 2016. The main strength of Löw and company has been the ability to use the resources masterfully, much better than the rest. Even with the cursory glance, we can see that during this span of time, the head coach relied on a relatively small core of key players. Schweinsteiger and Lukas Podolski participated in all 6 prolific campaigns. Lahm, Klose and Per Mertesacker, who left the team on the highest possible note after the World Cup triumph, in 5. Carefully keeping and protecting all the best he had, Löw was smartly adding the new faces when the new promising players were arriving. Thus Neuer, Özil, Müller, Kroos, Sami Khedira and Jerome Boateng poured into the national side before the World Cup 2010 in South Africa, and after that Mats Hummels and Mario Götze established themselves as the steady internationals. United as one, with 2 groups of players, reached the sweet spot in 2014, but frankly speaking, Löw never had at his disposal 30-40 really good footballers in parallel, like his predecessor and colleague Vogts did in the first half of the 1990s. It was an art of balancing in the first place, multiplied by a pretty meticulous, extremely competent preparation to each major tournament. But obviously it couldn't last forever. While the retirement of decorated veterans in 2014 didn't turn into a huge issue thanks to the force of inertia and all supplies, the deepened form of many influential players definitely left Löw off guard before the World Cup 2018. Manuel Neuer has been sidelined for a year due to an injury and completely lost his rhythm. Thomas Müller endured a bad moment in his career back then. On top of that, he is a type of star who largely depends on overall form of the team, whereas Ozil also significantly dropped the level of his performance. As a result, the Germans were basically left without world-class players, very much like in the early 2000s. Meanwhile, Löw was doubly needed them, keeping in mind the style of play he cultivated. For the record, this team is interesting by itself. Beginning with 2004 and up to 2010, the Bundesteam played in an up-tempo football, mainly because this sort of tactics allowed to disguise the lack of stars, but also due to the specifics of the German league, which is traditionally the arena of end-to-end action. But after two sound defeats from Spain and with the new crop of players, Löw started the movement to the possession-orientated game. And while in 2012 the style has been an effective merge of two directions of football, in 2014 Germany in terms of manner were pretty similar to Bayern of Louis van Gaal, Jupp Heynckes and Josep Guardiola. But as you know, this highly intelligent and in a sense exalted type of play is in particular demanding on the quality of personnel, and if in 2014 Löw had it, he definitely lost it by 2018. The other explanation of the German woes has the indirect character. The big trio ruled international football for many decades, but the times changed. Whereas only two of the first 18 World Cup finals went without Brazil, Italy and Germany, it's worth pointing out that one of that pair of cases fell on the first edition of the tournament, where both European grandes were absent. 3 out of the last 4 ultimate matches featured none of this threesome. In fact, only the Germans among them were able to reach this prestigious plateau since 2006. All this is no other than a consequence of major shift in the balance of power in the international football. In short, while weak national sides remains weak, the gap in quality and skills between the elite and middle group is getting smaller and smaller. In the situation when the world of football continued to expand its boundaries, the players from various countries could develop themselves and their career much more freely than in the 1980s and the early 1990s, and thereby the teams like Croatia, Japan, South Korea and some others significantly raised their game. The margin for error is very little now, with Germany experienced in 2018 and 2022. Meanwhile, each of the last 3 bad harvest campaigns had its own traits. Facing lack of star players in 2018, Löw certainly couldn't complain about it in 2021. Neuer overcame injuries and regained his classic form. Antonio Rüdiger, back at the time, was one of the best central defenders on the planet. Müller, Leon Goretzka and Joshua Kimmich were among the top players too, but after the fiasco in Russia, the head coach visibly lost his way and the control over the team, as a result of which they looked disjointed. As for 2022, the quality of personnel definitely was there too. Hans-Dieter Flick seemed a manager who is very much in form, at least at the beginning of the tournament, but the other problem abruptly surfaced. Flick, who brilliantly managed Bayern for a year and a half, hasn't been able to adapt his peculiar and at times desperately risky style to the requirements of international football. Constantly gambling on a high defensive line, he lost much more than gained. At the same time, the absence of prolific and implacable goal scorer up front working at Bayern, Flick had it in Robert Lewandowski, made the German attack much less sharp and effective. In the situation when the defense couldn't and shouldn't be immaculate, the attack was under extreme pressure to perform, and 6 goals in 3 games were simply not enough. After that, the things went in a familiar direction, and if the inglorious World Cup elimination in 2018 just undermined the authority of Löw, whose accomplishments with the German national team were undisputed, Flick, who was a newcomer in the international football, immediately lost his worth and trust of the players. The end of his tenure turned into torture. The big irony is that he became the first ever Bundesteam manager who was sacked. Julian Nagelsmann, who succeeded him, is facing the same issue. He is a club coach by nature so far, and now must adjust to a completely new reality. The fact that Nagelsmann, unlike Flick, bets strictly on fast football just magnifies the issue. Yes, this type of play is easier to install than the highly intelligent, sophisticated attacking build-up that has been the hallmark of Germany for a decade, but even the new conception is difficult to implement, given that the young Julian used to practice rigorous training sessions and strenuously exercised players, while this tactic will be hardly applicable in June before the domestic Euro, after the grueling club season. In its golden decades, almost all the Bundesteam head coaches were free of club football experience. Beckenbauer, Fox, Völler and Klinsmann didn't have it at all, while Sepp Herberger, Helmut Schön and Jupp Derwall had very little of it. Only Riebeck, who won the UEFA Cup with Bayern, could be considered as a prominent club manager, but it didn't help him. As for Löw, he is right between them, bearing in mind his experience at Stuttgart, where in the 1990s he won the German Cup and subsequently reached the Cup Winners' Cup final. But after that, he kind of disappeared from the club map. His work at Turkey and Austria was unheralded, and approached the job of his life being free of the appropriate stamps. On the contrary, after 2 years in the role of Klinsmann's chief assistant, Löw was imbued with the mentality of the international football. In the 1960s and so on up to the late 1990s, bet on those who wasn't involved in club affairs was not only advantageous but also absolutely logical thing, keeping in mind that national sides were head and shoulders above all the other ones. In that case, the lengthy work at the helm of a club could rather hinder serving as a befuddling factor, but now this transformation carries a different type of risk. The club football overtook the international one and went so long ahead that those managers who are switching to the work with national sides must not only make a lot of adjustments, but basically reinvent themselves. Flick wasn't able to do it in time. Now it's Nagelsmann's turn, and the net result at the Euro 2024 largely depends on to what extent he will be able to adapt to the concrete squad and specifics of a month-long tournament. As for the whole Bundesteam, it's a question of gathering all the pieces together. Without it, even the home crowd and other pluses of the native turf will be largely irrelevant, like it was in 2021.